All right, so thank you all for joining me this morning. My name is Elias de Burton. I'm going to be talking to you about English royal forests, how they came to be, how they were administrated, what you could and could not do in a royal forest in England. And so I'm a big fan of the I'm going to tell you what I'm going to tell you. I'm going to tell you what I tell you, and then I'm going to tell you what I told you model of teaching. So some of the questions I'm hoping that this class will answer are: what was a royal forest? How did royal forests develop in England? Who was in charge of the forests? And then how did these forests change over time? And so the first thing I'd like to do is talk about what is a forest. So when I say forest in the English medieval legal sense, I am talking about an area that is a hunting preserve of the monarch. Now, that's not completely accurate in the sense of how we think of preserves, but it's the closest thing for a very short definition. This area was specifically subject to forest law, but it was not necessarily a woodland. So on the side of the screen, the slide, I have an image of Dartmoor. Dartmoor was a royal forest during the medieval period. This image shows Seward's Cross, which was one of the boundary markers in the 1240 perambulation of the Dartmoor Royal Forest. And you can see this is mostly rolling hills, grass, rocks, not a lot of trees. Beneath that, we have sort of, I think, the iconic Royal Forest, the Royal Forest of Sherwood, which has at least been partially forested since the last ice age. So that's probably more what folks think about when I say the word forest, but both of these were royal forests. Now, in order to talk about royal forests, I have to talk a little bit about commons because they really stand in contrast to each other. A royal forest was an area in which people did not have the rights that they might have in commons. So a common was land within a manor where tenants might be able to do certain things, might be able to use the land in certain ways. Now that might be grazing livestock or swine, that might be gathering materials to burn for fuel, but it was an area in which folks were able to use the land. And so sometimes commons were afforested, and that usually caused a little bit of a stink, and sometimes forests, when they were disafforested, became commons. So there's sort of a flow between those two ideas. But I want to circle back around to that idea of forest law, because what really defines a forest is it is an area that is subject to forest law. And so what is forest law? Forest law, simply put, is a system of laws that protect game animals and their habitat for the monarch's hunting. And so forest law, there's a number of ways you can violate forest law. You can commit offenses against the greenery, the vegetation, the habitat of those game animals that are protected, or you can commit offenses against the venison, the game animals themselves. Now, in this time period, venison did not specifically mean deer, it meant game animals. And this was a set of laws that was outside of common law. It was enforced by separate officers, it was enforced by separate courts, and there's a really, I think, a very telling quote. This is from the Lord Treasurer in the late 12th century. So this is someone very high up in the government expressing his opinion of forest law, where he says, the forest has its own laws based, it is said, not on the common law of the realm, but on the arbitrary legislation of the king, so that what is done in accordance with forest law is not called just without qualification, but just according to forest law. And so you can see that, you know, even somebody who was quite important in the government was a little bit salty about forest law. So this is a really sort of strange, arcane system where you have a separate set of laws, a separate set of courts, a separate set of law enforcement officers. And so one question when I was digging into this that I had at least was, well, how the heck did this happen? How did you get this very sort of strange system in England? And so in order to sort of answer that question, we're going to be sort of tracing a little bit of historic telephone almost. And before we get into that, I want to quickly go through some of the important interactions between kingdoms, cultures, empires that I believe had an impact on the formation of forest law. And I want to do a quick rundown of those just to give everyone a reminder of some European history. Now, this is going to be both very generalized and very narrow. So if I oversimplify or ignore your personal period of interest, please do not take offense. I'm just trying to highlight some of the dynasties, kingdoms, empires that I'll be discussing in this talk. And so we're going to be starting with Rome. Rome had a lot of diplomatic relations, one of which of note that we'll discuss briefly was diplomatic relations with Persia. They inherited some hunting ideas from the Sasanian Empire. Rome, through conquest or treaty, influenced the Britons and the Franks. After the collapse of the Western Roman Empire, the Franks rose to prominence and created the Kingdom of Francia. Around that same time, the Germanic migrations took people from Northern Europe into England, and we had the formation of who we know of as the Anglo-Saxons. The Lombards rose to power in Italy. The Byzantine Empire continued on as the eastern portion of the Roman Empire. Again, under the Carolingian dynasty, you had, again, sort of a re-injection of some of these Eastern ideas about hunting. The Carolingians conquered the Lombards and again absorbed some of the Lombard ideas about hunting and forest management. The Kingdom of the Franks split into 3 different pieces. And then around in the 9th century, the Norse started conquering lands in what we now know as England and France, forming the Danelaw in the late 9th century in England, and the Duchy of Normandy in the early 10th century. And we'll talk a little bit more about the details of that. And then we all know what happens in 1066 with regard to English history. The Normans conquer parts of what will become England. You get the formation of what we call the Anglo-Normans. And then around the 13th century, we finally kind of settle out into something similar to what we would think of as England and France. So like I said, very, very brief overview of a very generalized, narrow slice of European history, but hopefully that will give y'all a little bit of context when I start going through kings and emperors and things like that. So like I said, we're going to start with Rome. Hunting law in Rome was, in its way, pretty straightforward. Game animals, wild animals, fell under a legal category called res nullius, which literally translates to nobody's thing. So res nullius is ownerless property that can be acquired by seizing or occupying that land structure, animal with the intent of owning it. And so, it applies most cleanly to things like squatting or abandoned buildings or property, things like that. But it also applied to game animals. So wild beasts, fish, and birds were considered res nullius until they were captured or killed, at which point they became the property of the individual that captured or killed them. And an important note on this is that land ownership did not alter that. So you could go onto someone else's land, kill a wild animal. You obviously couldn't kill their livestock, but you could kill a deer or a boar or a bird, and that was fine. That did not make the fact that you were on their land did not make the animal that you killed their property. You got it, it's yours. The little bit of a addendum to that, though, was if the landowner made an effort to keep you off of the property, if they built a wall, if they built a fence, if they had guards that were chasing people off the property, then they could claim some ownership over those wild animals. So sort of like how you can put up a no trespassing sign on your property nowadays, and that'll make a difference. And so, of course, what did folks do? They built walled game parks because under Roman law, if you try to prevent entry with a wall, then now you can exert some ownership over the wild animals on your land. And so this was imported by Roman emperors who were inspired by these massive walled gardens called paradises that were found in the East that have a very long lineage. They imported them directly from the Sasanian Shahs, so Persia, but there's a long history of these game parks in India and China, places like that. And so these were not small parks either. One particular park that was constructed in the 4th century CE consisted of 55,000 acres surrounded by 6-foot-high stone walls that were 45 miles long. This was a serious undertaking. And so that's when we sort of start to get this idea of you can own these wild animals, but only under very particular circumstances. And so when the Merovingians, the Frankish dynasty that arose after the collapse of the Western Roman Empire, started creating their laws about land ownership, about hunting, things like that, they stuck pretty largely to that res nullius, that nobody's thing Roman legal system for hunting. And so they said, you can own the natural resources on your property. You can own the trees, you can own the ore, but you can't own the wild animals. And so there's a couple of Merovingian laws. The Salic law around 500 CE and the Ripuarian law around 630 CE that said, you can't steal people's wood. You can't just bring your pigs in to eat all of their nuts and acorns and things like that. That's not allowed. You can't take people's natural resources, but it didn't say anything about hunting. Interestingly, the Ripuarian law in the 7th century specify that there were certain types of woodlands that were owned by the king. So sort of the predecessors of what we would consider royal forests. But you couldn't get into any more trouble stealing the king's woods than you could anybody else's wood. It was the same penalty. Don't do it. But the king was not exacting a more serious penalty for stealing his wood compared to, stealing your neighbor's wood. This sort of starts to change. We get the kind of inklings that something different is happening in the 7th century in these Merovingian charters. So these grants of land, things like that. You get the term forestus appearing. Now, forestus, scholars are sort of debating where that term comes from. It was used distinctly from silvae, which is the Roman Latin word for woodland. And it probably came from foris est, which is Latin for it is outside, or first, which is Frankish for an enclosure, or it could be sort of a combination of those two words. And so this described a wilderness area owned by the monarch and off limits to the public. And that's more what we're talking about when we say foris est, it is outside, not it is literally in the outdoors, but it is set aside. It is outside of sort of public availability. And so these forests, these sort of first royal forests, were not exclusively woodlands, which is a characteristic that carries forward. They could be wooded areas, they could be meadows, mountains, valleys, waterways. Interestingly, they could include manors and farms. So there could be individuals who owned land within these royal forests. And that's an important thing that we're going to be coming back to when we talk about the system in England. There's also some evidence that these forests were under the supervision of royal foresters, so royal officials. So we have our first sort of idea of having special law enforcement officers that take care of the king's land in these forests. But the charters that talk about forests under the Merovingians don't talk about hunting rights. They're still going with that res nullius concept. We still don't own the wild animals, even if we own the land. And foresters did sometimes try to prevent people from entering the forests, but they really seemed more intent on protecting natural resources like wood than they were protecting the animals and preventing hunting. So we've got some of these first sort of seeds of what will carry on into the English system, but still a lot more freedom than what was granted to people in several centuries. And so this sort of starts to change under the Carolingians. So Pippin III, the first Carolingian monarch, king of the Franks, on his deathbed, granted a forest to the monastery of Saint Denis because he wanted to be interred at the monastery of Saint Denis. So in this charter, there's sort of some interesting things, though. He expressly includes the right to hunt. He expressly says, okay, monks, abbots, you have ownership of these wild animals. So there we have this idea that the king can grant ownership of wild animals to someone, which implies the king owns the wild animals, at least within his forest. Charlemagne expanded this idea. He confirmed the grant of this forest to Saint Denis after his father's death. It would be kind of a not cool move if he was like, yeah, my dad gave this to you on your deathbed, but I'm gonna take it back. But he confirmed the grant of this forest. He said, yep, you can have this forest, but you can only hunt roe deer, which were the least prestigious deer. So he didn't say you can hunt whatever you want. He said, you leave the red deer for me, those are mine. And he sort of made the abbot his game warden. He said, if anybody wants to hunt in the forest, you have to go get permission from the abbot. So he sort of turned the abbot into one of his foresters. Under Charlemagne, we see forestes being distinguished from silvae. So this is when we're really settling into these being two distinct terms that cannot be used interchangeably. They mean different things. And then at the very beginning of the 9th century, we get Charlemagne banning hunting in his royal forests. So now we're really sort of crystallizing that idea that the game in a royal forest belongs to the king. And this change is likely due to the influence of the Lombards. Charlemagne conquered the Lombards, And Lombard kings had these spaces called gahagia. And that's going to sound very much like a term we're gonna see again in a little bit. So these private wilderness areas called gahagia made a legal distinction between land ownership and hunting rights. So the Lombards both had these wilderness areas that were set aside for the king, and were also making a distinction between owning land and being able to hunt on that land. And so it seems like Charlemagne took some of these ideas and started to incorporate them in his own charters. There was also contact again with the Near East, the Abbasid caliphs, and the Byzantine emperors. And it seems like that reintroduced this idea of a walled game park back into the Frankish royal legal system. Interestingly, they didn't retain the word vivarium, so it suggests there was a break. They called these brugili. And so it's under Charlemagne that we really get some of these impactful changes that are going to define the royal forest system once it gets to England. Before we get to England, though, we have to make a stop in Normandy. So Normandy, the Duchy of Normandy, was formed when the Viking leader Rollo conquered part of West Francia from Charles III. Charles III said, you know, if you swear fealty to me, if you protect this area from further Viking invasion, because they've been having trouble for a while, and if you convert to Christianity, you can be a duke and you can rule over this duchy, and I'm going to largely leave you to your own devices. And Rollo said, nice, good deal. I will do that. And so you got the formation of the Duchy of Normandy, Normandy coming from the Norsemen who had conquered the area. And the Dukes of Normandy took control of royal forests and game parks within the duchy. And so it's hard to find out a whole lot about Norman royal forests. Early 11th century Norman charters don't talk about forests a whole lot. So you see foresti, the word is changing a little bit, but you see the mention of these royal forests as being held by lords as well as the dukes. So it's not just the most powerful person in the duchy that can have a forest. Feudal lords can also have forests. Brogili, again, those enclosures, you also see the word high being used in charters show up. And you have some foresters. So again, this idea of these set aside areas with law enforcement officials who manage them, that's popping up in these charters. And there was a peasant movement in the Seine Valley that seemed to be motivated in part by restrictions on access to woodland and river resources. So something that we'll see in the royal forests in England, but specifically they seem to be upset at the feudal lords. So it seemed like the feudal lords were controlling these forests and placing these restrictions as opposed to the Duke personally. So there are definitely some similarities in what will be imported and what will develop in England in these early 11th century Norman charters, but it's not a one-to-one match. And so we all learn, okay, William the Conqueror, William the Bastard, William the First, whatever you want to call him, he's the one who brings these Carolingian-inspired forest law to England. And usually the story is he just sort of rolls up and just says, here's how we're doing things, just sort of imposes it tyrannically on the English people, well, the Anglo-Saxons at this point. But it's probably a little bit more complicated than that. So a fair question is, was forest law, or some version of it, present in England before the Norman conquest? So it's a hard question to answer. So we can look at it a couple different ways. If we look at the archaeological record, there's a shift in venison consumption in the 10th and 11th centuries. So in about the century before the Norman conquest, we see this shift where we get an increase of evidence of venison consumption at high status archaeological sites and a decrease at low status archaeological sites. So this suggests that something is happening, that perhaps game meat is becoming more of a status symbol. It's being reserved more for high status individuals. Low status individuals are having their access restricted. So it seems like something might be happening about 100 years before the conquest with regard to access to game meat. If we look at charters, there's a term that pops up. It's haga. It's plural hagen. And this bears some similarity, at least at a glance, to the hagia that we saw under the Carolingians in Francia. And it's translated as a hedge or an enclosure. And it shows up in rural and urban spaces, so it's really kind of hard to really pinpoint what this thing is other than some sort of boundary. But when you look at it in wooded areas, it really does seem to indicate some sort of demarcation. You do find in one charter in 1045, there is the term der Hage, which is translated as a deer enclosure. So something similar to a deer park. And that is explicitly in the charter differentiated from the surrounding wood. This is a land grant. Someone is saying my servants, after I die, can access my woodland. They cannot access my deer enclosure. And so, again, there's not a lot there, but that's suggesting that there is some sort of restriction happening. There's also some evidence that late Anglo-Saxon kings were engaging in recreational deer hunting similar to the style of hunting practiced by the Normans. So I'm specifically referring to a hunt par force, where you have a bunch of dogs, you have a bunch of horses, you chase the deer through the woods. It's a way to show your courage and your prowess as a horseman, all your fine hunting dogs. And so we're seeing some of that show up before the Normans conquer England. So the idea that William introduced all of this out of nowhere doesn't seem quite right. He definitely, changed things, but we have these deer enclosures. A lot of these hagen were converted directly to Norman hunting parks. So the idea is there was something there that the Normans then sort of laid their claim to. Legally speaking, there is the Constitution of the Forest, which is attributed to Canute the Great. This restricts hunting to landowners and forbids hunting on royal lands, but the authenticity of this law is in debate. It was previously considered entirely just to be a forgery, 12th century forgery by Angevin kings trying to say, no, you've always had forest law, don't be mad at us. But there's actually been some newer scholarship that suggests that maybe it's not entirely a forgery. So that's very much still up for debate. But I thought I would mention it because it is interesting. And so the early Anglo-Norman forests look actually a lot like the forests in Normandy. So William I created a few forests. The most famous or infamous is the New Forest, where he supposedly burnt entire villages and chased people out so he could have the land to hunt. More recent geological surveys have suggested that the New Forest was not a very fertile area, and so likely wouldn't have sustained a large population. So it's sort of hard to say what was really going on there. But under William I, feudal lords also held forests. They especially held them along the Welsh border. The Normans didn't conquer Wales. And so it could be that these were important lords for the defense of William's kingdom. And he wanted them to have certain privileges, like having their own forests. And these also were not strictly hunting areas. These were multi-use areas. And there's some evidence that foresters were employed to manage these areas, but there's really not a lot of information about what the early Norman kings were doing with the forests. There's not evidence for a separate forest court yet. It seems like shire courts, the sort of standard local court of the day, were the ones that were dealing with forest law. And it seems that foresters in this time period, especially under William II, William Rufus, William the Conqueror's son, they protected the beasts of the chase, but a lot of what they were doing was preventing people from cutting down trees and removing undergrowth and clearing land for cultivation. And so under Henry I, we get a little more detail about what forest law actually entails. So under Henry I, you have to get permission to clear land. You have to get permission to cut down wood. You're not supposed to be hunting or carrying bows or spears in the forest. If you had dogs in the forest, you had to cripple them effectively so they couldn't chase the king's deer. You would cut the leg sinews so they wouldn't be able to run after the deer. You had to pay a fee to graze your livestock in the forest. You had to get permission to build structures in the forest, and there were there was a certain way of dealing with evidence of poaching. So if you found evidence of poaching, what did you do with it? We had that outlined. Fines were the most common penalty, but under Henry I, especially if you were caught poaching, you could be blinded and castrated or killed if you had done it more than once. But at the same time, exemptions to forest law were common, especially granted to monasteries, because Henry I wasn't really looking to have a big fight with the church. So a lot of times abbots would be given permission to clear land or hunt within forests. And there is evidence of the first forest ear, the first court specifically enforcing forest law under Henry I. So under Henry I, we sort of start to get the formation of what this system is going to look like at its height. But unfortunately, he died without a direct male heir. And so there was a lot of turmoil between Henry I and Henry II, and most of what Henry I established was kind of lost during that intervening time. And so when Henry II comes to the throne, he sort of has to restart everything. And so again, we have some information about what was forest law dealing with under Henry II. So under Henry II, nobody could have a bow, arrows, or dogs in the royal forest. Dogs kept in the forest would have to be lawed, which instead of cutting the leg sinews, now you're just cutting off a couple toes from one of their feet to again prevent them from chasing deer. Landowners, folks who owned land within a forest, had to hire their own foresters. And then landowners in a forest could cut wood for their own use. So if they needed to burn wood or if they needed to make repairs to structures, they could do that, but they weren't allowed to give away or sell wood from the land that they owned because they lived in a royal forest. And then the forest would be inspected to make sure people weren't cutting down too many trees or clearing land without permission. And each county within a royal forest had to appoint knights to inspect the forest. These were called regarders, and knights to collect rent for grazing livestock in the forest. These were called agisters. And we'll talk about the specific roles of different forest officials in a little bit. And so Angevin forest law under Henry II was still pretty rough. You could be punished by fines. Typically, if you're cutting down trees or things like that, it's going to be a fine. But again, poaching, you get into blinding, castration, and death. Henry II really seemed to not use a ton of physical punishment unless you were, a serial poacher, unless you had demonstrated that you could not be trusted to not steal the king's deer. Richard of the Lionheart, actually added provisions to forest law. He said that the inspection of the forests, which is called the regard, was to be held every 3 years. You couldn't have carts in the forest during certain times. You couldn't have pigs in the forest during certain times. And instead of killing you, if you were killing the king's deer, we'll just blind you and castrate you. So I guess that's better. I don't know. John, I think this is fascinating because I think so many of us have this association with King John and forests from Robin Hood. John didn't change forest law or expand the royal forests. He just got really, really good at enforcing it and getting as much money from the forests as he possibly could. And so he would, whenever he pretty much needed money, he would send around the circuit justices on ear and say, hey, go find me some people who violated forest law and get some money from them. And he would use forest law to pressure opponents. So sometimes you would have buildings that had never been approved, but they had been there for 100 years in the forest and everybody thought it was legal. And he would have his folks go through all the records and go, nope, this is illegal. I'm gonna knock down your building unless you give me money. He didn't change forest law. He just really enforced it sort of to the hilt. And forest law was enough of an important thing that it was included in the Magna Carta. So in the 13th century, about a quarter of England was designated as forest. And this may have contributed to the tensions between John and the northern barons who eventually rebelled. It may have interfered with the barons doing their thing more than maybe in other parts of England. And some of the rebel barons' early demands included deforestation of certain areas. And so the Magna Carta includes articles that pertain to the forest. So all forests that were created by John would be disafforested. That doesn't really mean anything because he didn't deforest any land really. So sort of a nothing gesture. And all evil customs left unspecified by foresters would be investigated within every county and changed within 40 days. Of course, no one, John nor the barons, honored any of their promises in the Magna Carta. And so this didn't really do a whole lot. So where we really get a change in how forests are run is in the Forest Charter of 1217. And so this was written during the regency of Henry III. He was 10. And pretty much it reset everything. It said, okay, we're just gonna, we don't know what the boundaries of the forests are. We don't know what's happening. So we're just gonna say whatever was forest when Henry II was crowned, that's forest. Anything that's been forested later, it's not a forest anymore. And it's set that the regards would be held every 3 years, the inspections. So you couldn't just send your justices around and your regarders out if you needed money. There were restrictions on that. And the what were called swain motes, which were when you were checking the swine in the forests, would only be held 3 times a year. The lower forest courts would only be held every 40 days. So again, you couldn't just drag people into court whenever you needed to get a little bit of cash. Landowners were given a little bit more freedom within the forest, and you weren't allowed to blind or castrate or kill people for poaching deer anymore. And so this really established the framework for forest law in the 13th century. This is really how the forest operated in their height. And so let's do a quick rundown of what not to do in a royal forest. And remember, about a quarter of England was royal forest. Don't kill the king's deer. It's a big one. I think everybody knows that one. Don't carry a bow or arrows because you might be trying to kill the king's deer. Don't keep dogs, especially running dogs like greyhounds that haven't had a couple of their toes clipped. Don't graze livestock without paying the appropriate fees. Don't cut trees down, especially to the point of waste, which is where when you stand on a tree trunk, you can see, or a tree stump, you can see 5 other stumps. Don't collect fallen wood except for by permission and within sight of the foresters. So it doesn't matter if it's been knocked over and you really need to burn something. Don't be taking that wood. Don't dig up peat for burning. Don't clear woodland for cultivation. I don't care if you need a new farm or a new field. Too bad. You have to pay fines for that. You can't build structures or fences without paying the appropriate rent. You can't tan hides or practice any other trades that were considered detrimental to the deer. Tanneries were really stinky. The deers didn't like it. And so couldn't do that. And you need to remember that all of these rules apply to landowners. So a tree falls down on your own property, too bad, not yours. Unless you have the appropriate privileges granted to you by charters from the king. Want another field? Sorry, too bad. Want a building? No, even if it's your land. And so a big question becomes, how was this enforced? Well, through, again, a fairly arcane system. So we can break down the forests into different pieces. So the central government, a big chunk of England, the county, a specific forest, and what we call a bailiwick or a ride, which was a region within a forest. So the chief forester or the master forester or the chief justice of the forest was the main administrator. Initially there was one. It got to be too big a job in the 13th century, and it was split over 2 individuals, one for north of the Trent River, one for south of the Trent River. And they were the ones who were in charge. And so, but that doesn't really work on a actual individual forest management level. So you would have a warden. The warden had a bunch of responsibilities within the forest. They were the ones who got missives from the king. They were the ones who had to arrest and imprison lawbreakers. They took possession of evidence of crimes. They managed hunting. If it was a lean winter, they had to give the deer food, and they had to appoint foresters. Now, obviously that's a lot to do, so the deputy wardens ended up doing a lot of it. You had what were called sergeants in fee, which were hereditary officers. You would receive land in return for keeping part of the forest, and you had to work throughout the whole forest. Foresters in fee would have a particular bailiwick, a particular region of the forest that they were focused on, and they would oversee ordinary foresters, either walking or riding foresters, who would patrol the forest, and rangers. And rangers show up quite late. They show up in the 14th century. And really their whole job is to go get deer that have left the forest and chase them back in. So nothing like our sort of later ideas of rangers as a military organization. Remember I said that landowners had to have their own foresters. Those were called wood wards. They both answered to lords of manors who had hired them, but also to the warden. If they did a bad job, the land could be seized and brought under control of the warden. So they had their foot in two camps. The justices on ear were the folks who rode around and held the courts. The sheriff, while he was primarily the chief executive officer within a county, also had to work with the wardens and collect fines, make sure regarders and verderers were appointed, and had to actually hold that inspection every 3 years. The verderers were the ones who came and checked and see if there was damage. They would appraise damage. The regarders were the ones that performed that general inspection, make sure everyone's dogs were lawed, make sure everyone didn't have buildings they weren't supposed to have. This was a super unpopular position, so knights would actually pay the king to get out of it. They would give him a certain amount of money and say, okay, fine, you don't have to be a regarder. Agisters were the ones who supervised the grazing of livestock within the forests. And so those are all the folks who you might have to interact if you've been caught violating forest law. But what is that interaction going to look like? Well, it's going to depend on what you did. So let's start small. Let's say you've stolen wood from the forest. If you were caught gathering wind-fallen wood, so just dead wood off the ground, your trespass would be presented by a forester at the attachment court, whoever caught you, most likely. And it's most likely going to be settled on the local level. You'll have to pay a fine, and that fine will be due at the next attachment court, so in 40 days. So that's going to be taken care of pretty quickly. If you're cutting down wood, so taking green wood and chopping it down, that gets a little more serious. The verderers are going to come and appraise the value of the wood you've cut. And if it's determined to be worth less than 4 pence, you have to find 2 folks who will promise that they'll keep an eye on you and be on the hook if you don't pay your fine. And then you'll go to the 40-day court, the attachment court, pay your fine. And as long as you do all that, it's done. If it's worth more than 4 pence, you have to pay the value of the wood at the attachment court, and you have to show up at the forest ear, where you're going to be fined. It's going to be a higher fine. So what if you did the big one? What if you were poaching? You're going to be imprisoned. And while you're imprisoned, until the next forest year, which could be a few years away, you are not going to be fed. Other people have to take care of that. Foresters have other things to do. You have to rely on your friends and family to feed you. If you're wealthy, you can probably be released on bail. Your property within the forest is going to be seized to make sure you have some more skin in the game to actually show up to the ear. The meat of the deer you have poached will be given to the local poor or sick, and the skin will be given to the verderers to hold as evidence until the forest ear. Your trespass will be presented at the ear. You will be fined based on your income and importance. There's sort of a sliding scale. Sometimes this was used to cripple important people who folks thought should know better about poaching. If you can't pay, you'll be imprisoned for a year and a day. If you can't find folks who says, yeah, we'll take responsibility for this one, we'll keep an eye on them for future good behavior, you may be exiled from England. So if you've run out of friends by this point, you might be in trouble. So a lot of folks said, no, I'm not dealing with that, and escaped. And that's when you become an outlaw. That's when you get into a Robin Hood situation. And so the forests were really at their height in the 13th century. They become less important in the 14th century. They get really used as a political football to sort of decide who's on top, the barons or the king. And so Edward I, when he was on the outs with his barons, when they had more influence, said, fine, I'll do a new perambulation. I'll check the boundaries of the forests and we'll return everything to Henry II's coronation. We'll do that reset again. But then in 1306, he was in the position of power. And so he said, no, that 1300 perambulation, that never happened. And so he nullified that. And then in 1316, the barons were back with influence. And Edward II agreed, said, okay, fine, that 1300 perambulation, it did happen, fine. But then in 1323, he was back on top and said, nope, that didn't happen. I'm reafforesting that land that I've disafforested twice now. And so that nonsense happened for a little while until finally Edward III, during his regency, said, fine, that 1300 perambulation, it's legit. We're keeping it for real this time, y'all. And so that became the legitimate boundaries of the forests at that time. And that's really a turning point. You continued to have disafforestation after that point. Forest ears became less common. You started to get common law courts kind of taking on some of those responsibilities. A big reason for this is because in the 14th century, England started to have a national system of taxation. So the kings didn't have to rely on the forests for income anymore. They didn't have to go count how many goats you had or how many swine you had in the forest. They could just say, oh, you're a carpenter, give me this much money. And that was a lot more straightforward. And then that further changed in 1319 with the passage of the game law, not 1319, 1390, excuse me, with the passage of the game law, where now you had to be a wealthy individual to be allowed to hunt at all. So we're not even talking about in the forest. We're just saying, if you want to hunt, you must be of a certain quality. And so now poaching was not a matter exclusive to the forests. You could be poaching anywhere in England if you didn't make that cutoff. So again, sort of this supplanting of the forest courts by the common law courts. In the 15th century, we're mostly dealing with trespasses against the ver because we've stopped having forest ears, and we can't prosecute folks for those big trespasses against the venison because those have to be happening at an ear. Henry VII, the first Tudor king, when he came to the throne, he reissued the 1390 game law and added additional provisions. He briefly tried to revive forest ears with the War of the Roses and nobody knowing who the king was. They got kind of shuffled to the side for a little while, for about 100 years. And so he tries to start them up. And so there's like, for a few years, there's just this flurry of forest ears happening. And then around 1490, they kind of gave up again because it was just too unwieldy a system and it wasn't worth the trouble. And then so by the 16th century, we have Henry VII leasing forests. There was one lease that was renewed for 300 years until that area was finally disafforested. And then in the 16th century, forests became much less about game. They became much more about warships, about wood, about building the navy. Henry VIII was the last one to try to make a royal forest because of course, Henry VIII was the last one to try to make a royal forest in England. But really at that point, the ship had kind of sailed and forests lost much of their prominence. So quick review of what I told you. What was a royal forest? Well, it was an area subject to forest law with the intention of the game and the plants being preserved for the monarch. It was a little bit of a game of telephone to get it to England. The Romans introduced the idea of enclosed hunting grounds. The Franks were the really ones who really took that and ran and established the idea of the ownership of wild animals. William I then took this Frankish system that had been maintained into Normandy and overlaid it onto what appears to be some existing system in England. And then that formed the foundation of English hunting law, of English forest law. And then we had a whole group of officials that their whole job was to enforce forest law. Wardens were the principal official for each forest, but they had folks under them that actually did the day-to-day work. And then the legal side of things was handled through attachment courts, swain boats, and forestiers. And over time, there became changes in the economic importance of these forests, and more restrictive hunting laws moved some notions like poaching into the domain of common law and common law courts. And then there were some attempts to reinvigorate forest law by the Tudors. The 14th century is really considered that turning point for when forest law in England sort of began to decline. And of course, here are my references. I will go ahead and, if you missed it at the beginning, here is a link to a PDF of these slides, and you can go through my references and take a look. If you just want to read a couple things, I recommend the Royal Forests of England, which was published in 1905, but it's still really good and it's free online because it's out of copyright. Some other excellent books, depending on what you're interested in, would be In the Manner of the Franks, which looks at Frankish hunting law, or which one is it? Grant Raymond's The Royal Forests of England is also very good, but a little hard to get a hold of. So I'm going to go ahead and stop my screen share. I'm going to go ahead